All right, so we're resuming here with Joseph Campbell's Primitive Mythology. We're up to Chapter 7, which is called The Animal Master. And Chapter 7 is divided into three sub-chapters: The Legend of the Buffalo Dance, Paleolithic Mythology, and Part 3 is The Ritual of the Returned Blood. It's a short chapter, but it's a very good one, I think. He begins by recounting one of his favorite myths that he used to like to tell later on in his life, the Blackfoot Indian legend of the buffalo's wife, which he sees as containing some essential clues to what might be the nature of Paleolithic mythology. We don't have the myths from the Paleolithic, but there might be ways of sort of reassembling what the anatomical structure of it must have been like. And so in this myth, the Native Americans had a practice, and so also did the hunters of the Paleolithic, actually, of driving herds of animals over cliffs. It's a good way to kill a lot of them very quickly in large clusters. And so for some reason or other, one year the buffalo are refusing to go over the cliff. They just come up to the edge of the cliff and they stop there and look down. And down below there's this young Indian girl. They're starving. There's no food. The buffalo aren't dying. So she goes up, she looks at them up there and she says, "Oh, if only one of you would come down here, I'd marry you," just as a sort of jest. But it works, and the buffalo start pouring over the cliff in masses of broken backs and spinal columns and broken bones and so forth. And then one of the buffalo animal master, which is the sort of the shaman of the animal herd. The animals have shamans too. Comes over to her and says, "Okay, let's go. I'll marry you. You're mine now." She says, "Oh, what are you talking about?" And he says, "Well, you offered and I accept, so now you're going to be my wife." So he takes her away. So the tribe is missing her. They've got lots of buffalo meat to eat now. They've got full bellies, but they're missing her. And they talk to the father, and the father also misses her. And he says, "Well, I better do something about this and go find her." So he grabs his bow and arrow and his supplies, and he goes out looking until he finds a buffalo wallow. He can sort of spy them in the distance there. He sits down by a tree, strategizing as he's thinking about it, and a magpie comes flittering by, and he says, "Hey, magpie, I need your help." And the magpie says, "Sure, what can I do for you? Can you go over there and see if you can find my daughter amongst the herd? I know she's over there somewhere, but it's dangerous. Can you go spy it out, take a look for me?" The magpie says, "Sure, no problem." So the magpie goes flying along amongst the herds, hopping about until it finds the woman. She's there. Her husband, the buffalo man, is sleeping. The magpie goes up to her and says, "Hey, you know, your father's back over there. He's looking for you." And she says, "Oh, okay, well, just, all right, let me see what I can do here." The buffalo man wakes up, breaks off one of his horns, and he says, "Go fill this up with some water, would you?" And so she takes the horn, and as she goes to fill up the horn at the well, she goes by her father, and her father says, "Come on, let's go. Let's get out of here." She says, "Hold on. I mean, it's not that simple. Let me wait till he falls asleep again. I'll take him his water, and then I'll figure this out." So she brings the water back to the buffalo. He takes a drink of it, and he goes, "Aha, I smell a man." And he gets very riled up, and the other buffalo get riled up, and they go and they find the father, and they trample him to death, just trample him into the earth, into little tiny splintery pieces and so forth. And she's crying. The buffalo comes up to her and says, "Yeah, so now you know how we feel. We lose our family all the time to you, and this is how we feel." But he says, "Tell you what, I'll make you a deal. If you can bring your father back, if you can bring him back to life, we'll let you and him go. How's that?" She says, "Okay, fine." So she tells the magpie, "Can you go over there and see if you can find a piece of my father somewhere? There must be a piece of him somewhere. It needs to be a bone." So the magpie goes, flies around, finds a little piece of spinal column, brings it back, a little vertebrate piece, gives it to her. She puts it on the ground, lays a blanket over it, and begins singing the magic song of resurrection. Checks under the blanket. He's still cooking, puts the blanket back down, continues to sing until he's fully back, and then he sits up. There's Daddy back again. The buffalo are quite impressed by this feat of shamanistic magic, and they say, "That's pretty amazing. Tell you what, we'll teach you our song of magical resurrection, and when you sing it, we'll offer ourselves as a willing sacrifice, and we'll keep you replenished and supplied as long as you do the rites and do the buffalo dance." And so they agree to this, and that sets up the covenant between the animal and the human for the willing sacrifice, and leads to the creation of what's called the All Comrades Society, which is a hierarchically tiered organization of hunters amongst the Blackfoot Indians. So now, Campbell then says there are several clues in this myth, though it of course isn't a record of Paleolithic myth, but nonetheless, myths are incredibly conservative and do contain echoes that go over thousands of years. And so there may be some clues in the myth. He thinks there are 7 of them that might give us a sense of what Paleolithic myth is like. First, he draws our attention to the sculpture known as the Venus of La Selle, which is a relief sculpture sculpted onto the side of a cliff. And here she is here, the Venus of La Selle, holding up a buffalo horn in one hand, in her right hand, which has 13 incisions on it, possibly for a lunar calendar of 13 months, and her left hand is rubbing her belly. And the image was painted with red ochre, which is interesting to me because red ochre is normally used in grave burials all over the world. It started with modern Homo sapiens using red ochre. The oldest burial that we know of is that of a modern Homo sapien from Palestine, from Kafse. It's called Q9, in which a female has been laid out with her infant at her feet, and the whole thing has been sprinkled with red ochre. And now the Cro-Magnons like to use red ochre to sprinkle it on their dead. The Neanderthals didn't do this until much later on when they picked it up from interacting with the Cro-Magnons. Then they picked up a lot from the Cro-Magnons actually. But so now the question becomes, what's the red ochre symbolize? And obviously, as we recall from the Haxan myth, we saw Black Haxan creating the first human being, and he told the animals to go get red ochre, and he uses the red ochre as the symbolic of blood. So that confirms it pretty much, I think, that we know that red ochre symbolized blood for them, magical blood, possibly menstrual blood, since it was obviously wouldn't have gone unnoticed that the woman stopped menstruating once she became pregnant. So where's that blood? Maybe it's being used for the creation of a new body. So by magical analogy, if you sprinkle blood that's symbolic of the revivifying constructive powers of menstrual blood, which is used to build a fetus, then the red ochre then is the blood that has the magic to revivify the dead body. And so the fact that the Venus of La Selle was covered with red ochre indicates to me that there was probably a very strong magical resurrective significance to that image. Plus it has the moon, the buffalo's horn, just like the girl in the story who picks the buffalo's horn off, takes it off of his head, goes to fill it up with water. Here we have the buffalo's horn, 13 incisions, implies an analogy between the buffalo's horn and the moon, which dies and revives, the menstrual cycle, which is tied in with that. So all of that is packed into that image. So the 7 clues that Campbell sees in this myth that he thinks give us a sense of what at least the broad anatomical outlines of Paleolithic myth must have been something like this. The first point is that there is no dream time. In hunting myths take place in the present. There never was a dream time in these myths. It's an ongoing present process. The Australian Aborigines, of course, have a dream time and are hunters and shamans, but Campbell says that represents an infection from the planting cultures of Melanesia, where the myth of the in illo tempore, as Eliade puts it, the myth of Eden, the time of the paradise. We saw it in the Hainuweli myth with the dream time there, with the ancestral Dima beings coming into being. That's a characteristic of planting culture myths. We don't find it in the Blackfoot myth, and he doesn't think that it was in Paleolithic myth either. So point number 2 is that we see the presence of the shaman in the myth in the form of the magpie. The magpie is the shaman. It's the shaman normally transforms into a bird and communicates between humans and the animal powers. The third point is the significance of the bone. The magpie goes and retrieves a bone. The bone is in hunting mythology what the seed is in planting mythology. The seed is the key to the dying and reviving plant god, usually personified as the sacrifice of a human and death of a human being, whereas the bone is used to resurrect the same individual who is brought back. We saw the significance in the shamanic initiation rituals, where the shaman would go out into the wilderness and receive visions of his body being torn apart and the bones being used to reassemble his essence, usually with crystals or some other magical implement that's intermixed in with him. So the bone is very important in the shamanistic world. It's also key to the X-ray style art of shamanistic art. So the bone is crucial. The other point number 4 is this idea of the animal master now. Campbell calls it, this is something Leo Frobenius figured out, that hunting myths normally have a kind of shamanic equivalent. The human has a shaman that can transform into an animal, but the animal also has a shaman, the master animal of the herd, the animal master, who can communicate with the human. We saw that in the form of the buffalo man himself, which essentially represents the Platonic idea of the species. He is the timeless, undying personification of the sort of species of the animal, whose visible phenomenal forms are being killed on a regular basis for food, but yet somehow the indwelling aspect of the herd, the group soul, can communicate with the human through the animal master. The 5th point is that there is a willing covenant. The buffalo has agreed to offer the other buffalo on a regular basis as a sacrifice. So there's the myth of a covenant, an agreement between the human and the animal world that it is agreeing to give itself in return for propitiation. And that's point number 6, is that there's a right way and a wrong way to kill the animals, and the right way is done in accordance with the rites. The singing, the dancing, the hunt itself then becomes a sacred event. It's not a secular affair at all, the way we would do it, simply thumping a cow over the head with a sledgehammer. That's not the mentality that's involved here. The hunt is a sacred process. And finally, 7, the presence of a social hierarchy that all this patterns out into the comrades, the all-comrades society, which is based on a form of totemism, in which the tribe is usually has a sort of animal or half human, half animal primary ancestor that they are descended from, and they cannot intermarry within that same totemic clan. And then finally, Campbell recounts in part 3 the ritual of the returned blood, an account that he gives of Leo Frobenius staying with the pygmies of the Congo, who are also hunters, and they've been displaced from the plateau into the forest. They were hunters there, and he was spending time with them. They were running out of food, and Frobenius suggested that they go out and hunt another antelope, bring another one back. And the hunters looked a bit shocked at this, and they said, "Oh, well, that requires all kinds of preparations and rites and magic, and we'll have to arrange this. It'll take a little while. We'll do it in the morning." So before dawn, Frobenius goes out. He's out there with 3 pygmy men and a woman. So they're out there. One of the pygmy men is drawing a diagram on the ground with his finger in the sand of an antelope. They wait, and as the first rays of the sun come out and touch the image of the antelope, the hunter shoots an arrow right into its neck, while the woman raises her arms in the gesture of what's known in Egypt as the ka, which is the gesture of worship, of hierophany, and utters some magical phrases, and then the pygmies go off and they hunt and kill an antelope, which they bring back later that day. Then the next morning they have to go back and put blood on the image and erase it. So that's key, is the erasure and the returned blood. There's a magical reason for why that blood is returned. Frobenius says, because it takes a powerful magic to spill blood and not be overtaken by the blood revenge. It has to be returned as part of the agreement. Now, Campbell points out that this, in hunting mythologies, the sun is the great hunter, and the sun is analogized to the lion who appears on the plains and scares off the herds, just as when the sun rises, the constellations of the night sky scatter and run off, or the rays of the sun, as the hunter's arrows carry out the rays of the sun, slice into the constellations. And indeed, it is very possible. Campbell didn't know this. It wasn't discovered until, I think, the 1990s by a German archaeoastronomer named Michael Rappengluck, that indeed many of the images of these animals in the caves at Lascaux were representations of, most likely, of constellations. The Oryx number 18 in Lascaux, with the 2 horns pointing up, has 6 little dots above it, which Rappengluck thinks very strongly is probably a representation of the Pleiades, 6 of which are visible to the naked eye. The 7th is very hard to see. And if so, the Pleiades are always up above Taurus, then that would make that bull there the oldest constellation that we know of, which would be Taurus. And of course, nearby is Orion, the huntsman in the west. Orion is always the hunter, and so forth. So he identifies a number of these things going on in the caves but he thinks we're actual constellations. And I think Campbell, had he known about this, would have been very receptive to that idea. The constellations return. They return. They magically regenerate and rejuvenate the herds. They're the magical platonic forms etched into the surface of inscription of the dome of the night sky that guarantees the return of the animals. And so we'll leave off there with that chapter on the animal master.